Command, it's Ivanovich. I found them. They're 2 kilometers north of the Hemlock Cordon. They seem to have established some kind of settlement. I can see workshops and a large construction site. An attack should be made now while the structures are incomplete.
Oh, shit!
Hi, I'm Ed, and welcome to Minisodes. Games Workshop Studio Terrain back in 2nd edition was, to me at least, every bit as evocative as the miniatures they framed. In page after page of White Dwarf, codexes and other publications of the era, brightly painted heavy metal miniatures battled amongst grim backdrops consisting of phenomenal examples of scratch-built terrain. Amongst my favourites were these Ork buildings. Now, 30-odd years later, Dr.Spork has used his 3D printing genius to faithfully reimagine these iconic structures. He was kind enough to send me these 3, which I painted up for my Ork army. And last week, I received a care package from the good doctor, which included this awesome squat stronghold for Epic Space Marine, and this monster, Dr.Spork's most ambitious design yet, an Ork town. There's a lot of 3D printed goodness here, and plenty of fantastic detail to make these structures every bit as characterful as their Ork inhabitants. I began by getting my bearings and dry fitted the compound together. It comes in 4 big sections. The perimeter is bolstered by lots of wonky palisades and sandbags for the Orks to defend. And these big sculpted-on glyphs, or dags as the Orks call them, hint at the function or ownership of each building. One corner is built on a cliff, so it's nicely elevated. There's also a wall and an open gate. My favourite feature is the crow's nest in the middle of the courtyard. The whole thing is nicely proportioned, and I can already picture it teeming with Orks sallying out to defend it from a Blood Angel assault. Before we go any further, I just want to quickly thank this month's patrons for subscribing. A big shout out to Zach Donovan, Mastiff, Griffin L, Father Insect, Nick Oho Doubter, Gareth De Anthony, Nico Cousins, Alexander, GG45, Llewellyn Reynolds, Jeff C, and Errol. Right, I have literally a day and 3 evenings to get this thing painted before I go on holiday. So first things first, I made a plan, including a list of paints and the order in which things needed to be done. Phase 1 was to get a bit of texture and ground clutter down around the barricades and the bottom of the poles and girders. I used PVA for this, then sprinkled on some sand. So later on, I would actually decide to use my own DIY textured paint. So a fair bit of what I'm doing right now is kind of redundant, but hey, I learned quite a bit doing this project. It's all part of a process. After sprinkling off all the excess, I added a few drops of my isopropyl and PVA mix, capillary action all the way, and sealed this clutter in place. After some drying time, I transferred the model to a sheet of cardboard in readiness for priming. I chose Colourforge's Trench Brown, which I think is roughly equivalent to Steel Legion Drab. This would be a very brown, earthy piece of terrain, so this primer seemed like a sensible starting point. I gave the whole thing a good blast of the Trench Brown primer, getting into all the nooks and crannies, and turning the whole thing around multiple times to check every angle and Orky crevice was accounted for. Once the fort was dry, I returned to my painting desk and got to work on the first section. For the base coat on the buildings, I chose Talon sand, and I picked out the stiffest, nastiest brush in my possession. Strictly for stippling purposes, you see, then got to dabbing it all over the exterior walls of the building. There was no need to be too careful at this point, as there's more stippling to come, and I'd be painting the details like the doors and windows last. At least that was the plan. Lauren also jumped in to help me out with the rest of the buildings. After the Talon sand was dry, I stippled on a layer of Carrack stone, making sure this was a bit patchier, so some of the Talon sand shows through. I'm using a medium makeup brush for this. Convinced that the walls were finished at this stage, Spoiler alert, they weren't. I moved on to the wooden areas of the town by mixing some black acrylic paint with Gawthorpe brown. There's loads of wood to paint here. The palisades, the stakes, poles, planks, all crude and orky and held together with massive nails. Whilst waiting for the wood to dry, I painted the sandbags, which are a really nice feature, Zandri dust, and gave the gloomy insides of the windows a lick of Vallejo black. Now the wood was dry, I gave it all a loose overbrush of Gawthorpe brown, taking care to leave plenty of the base coat showing underneath to emphasise the wood's uneven grain and dodgy orc carpentry. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are only splinters. As time went on, I got increasingly less precious, going from painting to stippling to basically painting like an orc, slapping on the paint with a knackered brush. I then added a final highlight of Baneblade brown. To bring out a bit more definition, I took a small brush and hit the gaps and joins with a thin down wash of Garragat sewer, using my finger to wipe away any overspill. With the wood finally finished, it was time to get out the lead belcher and paint all the metallic parts of the town, stuff like the barred windows, reinforced plating, the spikes on the wall, and the girders. I also painted all of the orky chimneys. Whilst the metal dried, I used Rhinox hide to paint the roof tiles on both covered porches, and added a Karak stone highlight to all of the sandbags. Part of the town is built on a cliff, so I painted this rocky part Mechanicus standard grey, working my way around to where this natural defence merged into the wall. I also painted the exposed stones in the wall the same colour, to suggest that the orcs had used these materials in their construction. Now, at this point, I put one of the finished buildings alongside this project, and I realised that I'd completely forgotten to do the screaming skull on the walls. So back to stippling I went, but being a bit more careful this time, going around the window and door frames of each building. Actually, no real dramas here, as I'd caught this oversight before I started on the real details. When that was done, I touched up on any areas that had fallen foul of my enthusiastic stippling, and we were back in business. I glued the crow's nest and various balconies and bits onto the fort using PVA. Then transferred the now two halves of Ork Town into the kitchen, as by now it had rather outgrown my desk. I mixed in a little white into my Mechanicus standard grey and started highlighting up the stone. I went back and forth here, adding a little more white here and there, and then darkening up the grey where my highlights were a little bit over the top. I returned to my tiles and added a layer of Doombull brown over the Rhinox hide. It was now time for the proper details, and I got started on the checkered pattern around each building. These have been really helpfully sculpted on by Dr.Spork, so this was quick and really satisfying, to say the least. I used Corn Red here as a base coat, then highlighted it up with Evil Sun's Red. With the Orky decorations painted, I pulled out Garagax Sewer, Agrax Earthshade, and Coat d'Arms Brown ink. I used these three to thoroughly foul up all the metallic areas of the town, getting them into the recesses and areas that would be particularly prone to rusting and heavy use from Ork hobnailed boots. I used thinned down Garagax here to make some grimy streaks where the rust has essentially run down and stained the wall and rock. It can also be thinned down a bit before it dries. I also did this along the tops of all the glyphs. I thinned down some Agrax Earthshade in a jar with some filtered water and thoroughly washed this metal watchtower, along with any other metal areas that were looking a little too clean for their own good. I sped up the drying time a little with a hairdryer, then stippled lead belcher over all the metallics and went in with a smaller brush for the smaller areas of metal. Before flocking the base, I squirted out some cheap green acrylic paint and painted over all the areas that hadn't been trampled into dust by Orky activities. For those areas, I created a DIY basing mix made up of sand, PVA, and water, way cheaper than Sterling mud. I applied this in a thick coat and went in with a smaller brush for those hard-to-reach areas. The next evening, I dry brushed a few patches with Nurgling green to suggest lighter footfall where the vegetation was able to just hang in there, and then a dry brush of moot green. I then glued on some bushy basing materials I've had languishing in a drawer for probably over 15 years now, and stuck them in the corners and areas that weeds would probably grow. I then gave all the green areas of paint a lick of PVA, and poured flock onto them. You should sprinkle. I think it was probably about 1 AM at this point, so things were starting to unravel. After shaking off the excess, which was most of it, I glued on some more tufts and hedges to the perimeter. To seal all this in, I applied about 3 coats of my isopropyl PVA mix, working my way carefully around with my pipette. The next evening it was time for some final touches, including a few transfers and some more Orky art. After a final bit of weathering, I tied on some strands of string to represent the guide ropes on the precarious Ork crow's nest, and then painted these skeleton horde. It was done. The town was finished and ready to receive its garrison. Links to Dr.Spork's fort and all his other awesome designs, both fantasy and sci-fi themed, are in the video description. So what are you waiting for? Go and give yourself a good sporking. If you enjoyed this video and want to support my creative endeavors, then do please consider joining the Minisodes Patreon. You'll receive a monthly podcast and access to the Minisodes Discord, a growing community full of passionate, talented, and generous hobbyists with a fondness for the Warhammers of yesteryear. Hope to see you there, and until next time, thanks for watching, and happy hobbying.